Good day. Over the last few hours, there's been some confirmation, though the information is as yet tentative, about a collapse of Ukrainian resistance in Severodonetsk. There's been various different claims as to the extent of Russian control in Severodonetsk, but most assessments that I've seen accept that the Russians control between a half and 85% of it, with a few going further still and saying that Russia controls all the residential areas, apart from a few stragglers still holding out in a few apartment buildings, and with the main Ukrainian forces that were defending Severodonetsk having fled, as is now the custom in these battles in Ukrainian cities, East Ukrainian cities, having fled to the industrial areas located just outside those cities. Now, there was some discussion on some Russian blogs about whether this was an organized withdrawal, and certain comments by certain Ukrainian officials, including the Ukrainian governor of Lugansk province, might suggest that the Ukrainians have finally decided that this policy of standing and fighting and defending every inch of ground is a mistake, and that it's better to carry out organized withdrawals from untenable and undefendable positions to shorten supply lines, shorten the areas straighten out the areas that have to be defended, and to save troops and equipment from certain loss. I have to say straight away that actually the information from the ground, the information I'm getting from the ground, does not suggest that these withdrawals are orderly at all. There was an account by a French journalist, for example, which I read yesterday, in which the French journalist says that he was in Severodonetsk, that he spoke with a Ukrainian army officer in Severodonetsk, a city where he described the condition of the Ukrainian army as dire. But anyway, he spoke to a Ukrainian officer in Severodonetsk who was defending a bridge over the Severodonetsk River, a bridge linking Severodonetsk to the neighboring town of Lysychansk, and the orders that the Ukrainian officer had received and the troops he commanded was to defend the bridge and to prevent the Russians from capturing it. This bridge being presumably the bridge across which the Ukrainian troops would have to retreat if they were to flee from Severodonetsk to Lysychansk. Anyway, the Ukrainian officer told the French journalist that this order was illogical. And the reason it is illogical is because the bridge in question was destroyed some time ago. In other words, the Ukrainian officer is defending a bridge which does not actually exist. Now, this is particularly extraordinary, that this officer is apparently getting these illogical orders about defending a bridge which no longer exists from the Ukrainian High Command, given that I clearly recall about 2 weeks ago reports from many bloggers, information sites, multiple sources, both Russian and Ukrainian, which confirmed that this bridge had indeed been destroyed by a Russian missile strike. So it seems that the Ukrainian command, either the high command in Kiev or the regional command in Kramatorsk, is not aware of the actual situation on the battlefields and is less informed about the information on the battlefields than some bloggers, both on the Russian and on the Ukrainian side. And I have to say that this is only just one indication of chaos and confusion and disorganization on the part of the Ukrainian soldiers who are still trying to hold out in these towns and cities across the Donbass. we've now seen a succession of Ukrainian defeats and collapses. We've seen the Ukrainian troops leaving Severodonetsk, leaving Krasny Liman, without putting up any kind of sustained resistance there. I suspect it's the same situation in Severodonetsk. And apparently there's a video, which I have not seen, of two Ukrainian officers openly quarrelling and almost coming to blows with each other as they argue about whether or not to retreat, and about the retreat that one officer ordered, apparently without the agreement of the other officer. All the indications are not of soldiers fighting determinedly and then carrying out structured withdrawals on the orders of their high command. It is instead of Ukrainian soldiers giving up when they realize that their position is becoming untenable, when they can't take any more of the shelling and the bombing, when they've lost all hope of final victory or even of survival, and therefore increasingly they either surrender. And there were some reports earlier on in the fighting in Severodonetsk that an entire Ukrainian unit of perhaps 500 men had essentially laid down its arms and surrendered. I can't confirm that, but that's what I heard. But either that they surrender or that they flee. And of course, this suggests that just as Severodonetsk has apparently fallen, or largely fallen, after just a few days of fighting, the Russians apparently were prepared for a siege and battle in Severodonetsk that would last several weeks. But as I say, it seems to be ending after just a few days. Just as Severodonetsk, resistance in Severodonetsk has collapsed quickly, I suspect that resistance in Lysychansk, where the Ukrainian forces are admittedly more numerous and perhaps better organized, and where the town is somewhat more defendable as it is on higher ground, but nonetheless, I expect that resistance there will also collapse fairly quickly as well. So, no organized orderly withdrawals, rather a chaotic collapse as the Ukrainian forces in northern Donbass find it increasingly difficult to keep on fighting. And we're getting further reports also, by the way, that the Russian troops now are definitely closing in on Slavyansk from the east. The major Russian grouping in the north, in ETHEREUM, has not yet begun its principal advance towards Slavyansk, but it does look as if that will be activated fairly soon. And then Slavyansk itself, the northern part of the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation, where the Ukrainian military headquarters covering the Donbass is located, and many thousands of Ukrainian troops are also located. Well, that force also will soon come under the same kind of pressure that we've seen in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. And I would say Severodonetsk before the war was a city, a town of around 100,000 people. So we're not talking here about a small place. It's not as big as Mariupol. The Mariupol-Lysychansk conurbation is not as big as Mariupol was. But nonetheless, it's clear that the Russians are able to capture these places much more quickly than they could do earlier in the war. Now, this brings us back to the question of what Ukrainian tactics are. And I come back to the suggestions that many have made. The most eloquent and erudite commentator on this has been Scott Ritter, about what the Ukrainians ought to be doing, and perhaps some think are doing, which is building up their forces in the rear, re-equipping with Western weapons, holding on in Donbass for as long as possible to keep the Russians at bay, whilst the Ukrainian army is being built up in the center and west of Ukraine, also that Ukraine can then launch these great counteroffensives, which Ukraine has been talking about for many weeks now. And I have to say, I've always been a bit skeptical about this because as I've said before, I see no evidence that Ukraine is indeed following that policy. I see no sign of Ukrainian forces being actually built up in central and western Ukraine in the way these commenters think. And I've seen no sign that the policy is being implemented, as people say. And besides, I think that the extent of US military support for Ukraine is actually being overstated. Well, I'm now going to be even a bit more definite about this. Not only do I see no sign of Ukraine holding its troops back, building up its reserves in central and western Ukraine, in the way that rational people like Scott Ritter think it ought to be doing and assume it is doing. On the contrary, what Ukraine seems to be actually doing is feeding troops, more and more of its troops, into Donbass as it tries to hold territory there. So that instead of building up its forces in central and western Ukraine, it throws them into the battle as soon as new formations are created and as soon as Western supplies arrive. And already we've seen how the M777 howitzers have been apparently deployed in penny packets to the Donbass and Kharkiv fronts, with many of them apparently already destroyed. We see how the FH-70 howitzers supplied by Italy are meeting the same fate. We see also reports that Ukrainian troops, now re-equipped with these Polish tanks, are also being thrown into the battle in Donbass, where no doubt they will all be ground down and destroyed by the Russians very quickly. So instead of building up forces in central and western Ukraine, the better to hold on. Ukraine is throwing them away. It's not taking time to train up its troops properly. It's not finding the time to integrate these troops with Western weapons. The amount of Western weapons is running short anyway, but instead Ukraine is throwing whatever it has into the maelstrom of the battle in Donbass, where Ukraine is overwhelmingly outnumbered, perhaps not in men, but at least in material, in artillery, in rockets, in missiles, in tanks and armored vehicles, and of course where the Russians have total aerial dominance. The Ukrainians are throwing everything they have there, and that everything is being crunched up and destroyed. And by the way, it's clear to me that this is the major role in the battle up to now of this Russian force in Izium. It probably was first deployed, this is my guess, as I said, I'm not a military strategist or tactician, but I suspect that the Russians originally built up this force in order to have it advance on Slavyansk. That was the original Russian plan. But what has happened instead is that the Ukrainians have been throwing unit after unit, Ukrainian unit after unit, against this Russian concentration. In Izium, they've been trying themselves to cross the Severodonetsk river to cut off this Russian force in the flanks. They've been resisting it, trying to block its advances south from Izium towards Slavyansk. And I think that after a certain point, the Russian command decided that this actually suited the Russians perfectly well. Because what has been happening is that these Ukrainian forces are thrown against this major Russian concentration in Izium, and the Russian forces in Izium then simply destroy these Ukrainian forces that are sent to attack them. They're swatting them, in effect, like flies. And that's a brutal metaphor to use, one I'm uncomfortable in using, but that essentially seems to be what is happening. And the same has been happening on the flanks of this great battle that's been taking place in Donbass. We heard a great deal a few weeks ago about the Ukrainian counteroffensive northeast of Kharkiv. It was all over the Western media. This mysterious think tank, the Institute of War, which exists in Washington and which publishes various assessments of the war from a very pro-Ukrainian point of view. It talked up this great offensive that the Ukrainians were launching northeast of Kharkiv. The British media were all over it. They were talking about the great Ukrainian victory, how Ukraine had won the Battle of Kharkiv, and how this was, another Ukrainian triumph after the triumph in the Battle of Kiev. Anyway, that was the narrative. Ukrainian troops advanced. They tried to reach the Russian border. They got there in one or two places. They were then basically started to run out of supplies. The Russians then started to counterattack. The Ukrainians have been steadily driven back towards Kharkiv, which is once more very much within Russian artillery range. In fact, the Russians are now regularly shelling Kharkiv again. But more importantly, it seems that this attempted offensive northeast of Kharkiv, one which it turns out relied heavily on use of these M777 howitzers amongst other weapons. This counteroffensive in northeast Kharkiv, despite the fact that the Russian forces in this area were relatively limited in number, well, it has apparently been repulsed, with the Ukrainians experiencing very heavy losses. Now, President Zelensky recently visited Kharkiv, and it's interesting to notice how all kinds of people, Ukrainian officials and apparently Ukrainian military officers who were in Kharkiv have been replaced, and there's been some suggestions that Zelensky did that, or Zelensky's visit to Kharkiv was to bolster his political position. Well, I can't comment on that. I don't know for a fact one way or the other. But it does seem to me that the fact that there's been this mass removal and replacement of people, both civilian and military, may well be connected with what is increasingly looking like a debacle, not at all a victory, for the Ukrainians northeast of Kharkiv. And of course, going to the other end of the Donbass war, we've also been getting more and more reports about this, what actually happened at the start of this Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kherson region. Now, again, this was massively talked about in the British media, and I actually read, I think it was in the Daily Telegraph, a report about how the Ukrainians were sending out messages to the people of Kherson city, telling them, hold on, we're coming to liberate you, to drive out the Russian occupiers. Well, it turns out that the Ukrainian forces that were trying to move towards Kherson, they were very quickly spotted by Russian drones and other surveillance means, and they were quickly shelled by Russian artillery, and the Ukrainians have again had to pull back, apparently experiencing extremely heavy losses. Now, there's some talk that the actual headquarters, the Ukrainian headquarters in Nikolaev that was commanding this offensive, has been destroyed by the Russians with heavy loss of life, that there was a missile strike on this headquarters, and that up to 3 Ukrainian generals were killed there. Well, there was a missile strike, a Russian missile strike on Kherson, on Nikolaev rather, whether it really did hit headquarters, whether so many Ukrainian officials were indeed killed, whether 3 Ukrainian generals actually did die in this strike. All of that I don't know, and I'm not going to try and speculate and guess about this. All I would say is that there is some evidence, there's some talk that the Ukrainians are still planning to renew their attack on Kherson. But I have to say that I suspect if they do, the outcome will be the same as what we saw in northeast Kharkiv and as what we've just seen in Kherson as well. Another defeat with heavy loss of life. Now, there is clearly increasing criticism within Ukraine of this very strange strategy of trying to hold on to ground everywhere, to give orders to soldiers to go on fighting in hopeless positions. And as I've discussed in previous programs, and as we see with these Ukrainian soldiers now giving up and retreating basically of their own accord, fleeing from the battlefields if you prefer, though I don't like that word because it implies a lack of courage on the part of men who are brave men and who have been fighting with great courage up to now. But anyway, as we see these disorganized retreats, as we're getting more and more complaints from more and more Ukrainians within Ukrainian society about the way in which the war is being conducted. And there's been some suggestions that the mood in Ukraine is darkening and is turning against the Ukrainian government, and that the government itself is becoming increasingly uneasy and insecure. And there are some telltale signs which may suggest that that is true. Some days ago, the former president of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko, who is a political opponent of President Zelensky, and who is, by the way, being prosecuted by President Zelensky's officials, Poroshenko tried to leave Ukraine, to flee Ukraine, as some people said, and to go to Poland. And he was turned back at the border by the Ukrainian border police. And this has created complaints. It's a very strange incident. There's been no real explanation for what Poroshenko was trying to do or why he was trying to leave Ukraine. And the whole affair is extremely odd, but it does suggest that there's some tension within the Ukrainian political system. I would add that just before Poroshenko tried to leave Ukraine, he gave a long and frankly extremely uninteresting and self-laudatory interview to the Financial Times, which made me think that perhaps he was maneuvering again for some kind of return to political prominence. Well, who knows? But anyway, that does make me wonder whether everything is under control politically within Ukraine itself. And obviously, some are saying that some of these dismissals in Kharkiv were, as I said previously, a sign that Ukraine is trying to, that Zelensky is trying to shore up support, even as it starts to crumble around him, even as the military situation begins to turn against him. And, well, is clearly turning against Ukraine. And I've actually started to see some criticism of Ukrainian military policy in parts of the Western media as well. There was a very interesting article in The Guardian which finally acknowledged the essential truth about the way in which the Russians are waging this war, and the way in which, by the way, the Russians have been waging this war from the outset. On the Duran, Alex Christoforou and I myself on this channel, have repeatedly emphasized that the Russian objective is not to seize cities in a hurry, but rather to destroy Ukraine's ability to resist, to keep going, to fight by destroying the Ukrainian army. And the Ukrainian battlefield tactics or strategy in Donbass actually plays directly into this Russian objective. Instead of building up defenses, instead of preserving its army so that it can keep on fighting, Ukraine is throwing more and more of it into the hell of the battle in the Donbass, where it is getting destroyed, leaving Ukraine weaker and weaker. So the fact that we aren't seeing massive, rapid advances in eastern Ukraine by the Russians, they're not covering tens of kilometers a day, isn't a sign that the Russian strategy is failing or that the Russian offensive is going slowly, as some people say. On the contrary, it is a sign that from a Russian point of view, their Clausewitzian strategy of destroying the Ukrainian army is working well. And even Zelensky now admits that Ukraine is losing 60 to 100 men a day killed. It's probably much more than that. And 500 a day wounded. And again, it's probably far more than that. In my program yesterday, I mentioned how Ukrainian commanders in Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, according to a BBC journalist says that the Ukrainian commanders had told him that they basically ceased to count their casualties. So that gives us a sense of the scale of the disaster that is overcoming the Ukrainian army in Donbass. And I've also explained why I think Zelensky and his officials persist in this misguided strategy, even as the Ukrainian military leadership, the general staff of Ukraine, have apparently continuously advised against it. They've continuously advised against these misconceived counteroffensives, these attempts to regain territory which are achieving nothing except resulting in heavy loss of life for Ukraine. And they've also advised against this policy of standing and fighting at every place and at every inch of ground. And Zelensky and his political advisors have been rejecting this advice from their military leadership, because their objective is not to try to defeat Russia in battle, but to try to position Ukraine to get Ukraine into a stronger position in terms of the political negotiations, the negotiations that they expect will eventually happen and which will end the war. So they want to retain at any cost some presence in Donbass so that Ukraine can continue to claim Donbass when Ukraine sits down and negotiates with Russia. They want to have their troops on the Russian border in and around Kharkiv, so that the Russians are not able to make any claims on Kharkiv region. They want to regain control of at least parts of Kherson region, perhaps even Kherson city itself, so that they can retain these territories, or at least make a claim to retain these territories in negotiations. And until they achieve battlefield successes, which will enable them to try to recover some of this lost ground, they will continue fighting, because they do not want to be maneuvered into negotiations from a position of retreat and defeat and weakness, in which case they might be compelled to make concessions, territorial concessions, which they don't want to make. And this also explains US military supplies to Ukraine. The US has supplied Ukraine with considerable military equipment. It's not been successfully used to mount any kind of counteroffensives, but its purpose is to keep Ukraine fighting and holding on in all these territories in the east of Ukraine until supposedly the Russians tire themselves out, that the Russians suffer such heavy losses themselves that they start to retreat and fall back in places and are forced to come to the negotiating table and are obliged to negotiate with the Ukrainians and basically accept something far less than their initial objectives. And of course, there's also a hope that the Western sanctions will eventually force Ukraine to the same position. Now, this is, as I said in my previous program, an astonishing policy for Ukraine to follow, throwing away the lives of its soldiers in order to try to win bargaining points in a negotiation which Ukrainian leaders appeared to know that is coming. But what is really remarkable is that it's clear that it isn't just Ukraine that is approaching this war in that fashion. It is the United States as well. It is the Biden administration that is urging Ukraine to follow this strategy. And we know this because we've actually now had it from, as we say in Britain, the horse's mouth. President Biden himself has now given written an op-ed for the New York Times in which he says what US objectives are. And I'm going to quote some extracts. He says the following: "We do not seek a war between NATO and Russia. As much as I disagree with Mr. Putin and find his actions an outrage, the United States will not try to bring about his ouster in Moscow. So long as the United States or our allies are not attacked, we will not be directly engaged in this conflict, either by sending American troops to fight in Ukraine or by attacking Russian forces." That's President Biden speaking. And then he goes on to say that we will continue providing Ukraine with advanced weaponry, including Javelin anti-tank missiles, Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, powerful artillery and precision rocket systems, radars, unmanned aerial vehicles, Mi-17 helicopters and ammunition. We will also send billions more in financial assistance as authorized by Congress. We have moved quickly to send Ukraine a significant amount of weaponry and ammunition so it can fight on the battlefield and be in the strongest possible position at the negotiating table. So, it's no longer outright victory. Even the administration, the White House, seems to have realized that that is beyond reach. It's not regime change in Moscow anymore. That was clearly the agenda in February and March. That was what the economic war was all about. It's now trying to save as much of Ukraine as possible, trying to deny the Russians the objectives they set for themselves at the start of the war: Donbass, recognition by Ukraine of the loss of Crimea, those sort of things. Obviously, we don't want the Russians acquiring, also the US also doesn't want the Russians acquiring Kherson region and Zaporozhye and Kharkiv and all those places. It's no longer achieving victory. It's trying to return to something like the status quo, a situation where presumably the Russians hold on to Crimea and pull back to the original ceasefire lines that were negotiated in 2015. And that's why Ukrainian troops are being sacrificed in their hundreds and probably the thousands, probably every day, in Donbass, as they're sent to their death or wounding or into hell. How they describe this war. It's in order to prevent what is now increasingly looking like a debacle, turning into an outright defeat, a defeat for Ukraine, obviously, indeed a catastrophe for Ukraine, but perhaps more importantly, a debacle for the Biden administration and its backers, and of course for the neocons as well, to hold the line at the cost of Ukrainian lives, in the hope that the Russians will somehow at some point tire of this war, and in the hope also that the sanctions on Russia finally start to have some of the desired effects, not perhaps causing the Russian economy to implode. That was the hope in February and March. I don't think anybody, even in Washington, expects that anymore, but hoping that perhaps the Russians will start to feel the pinch. They'll decide that this has gone as far as it can go, that the losses that they're experiencing are too great, that the economic losses that they're experiencing are too great, that the United States has signaled that it's giving up regime change in Moscow, and therefore that the Russians can themselves call it quits. That seems to be now the plan. That's the Biden administration's plan. They know that they're losing in Ukraine, but they're reinforcing failure in order to prevent an even greater defeat that may now be looming on the horizon. And we see how this is now creating increasing confusion, because there has been this enormous discussion over the last few days and weeks about supplying Ukraine with long-range missiles. And this has been a bizarre stop-go affair. One day we're told that these missiles are going to be supplied. Other days we're told that they won't be. It's not even clear what's being discussed anymore. Is it multiple rocket launch systems of the M270 variety? Is it the lighter wheeled systems? Clearly, it's not going to be ATACMS, long-range missiles that can launch deep into Russia. Something is going to be supplied. It's unclear what, and it's unclear to what precise purpose and end. Let's just go back to that list of weapon systems that Biden mentions or refers to in that op-ed in the New York Times. He talks about advanced weaponry, including Javelin anti-tank missiles. Well, the Ukraine has already had thousands of these things sent, and they proved ineffectual. Stinger anti-aircraft missiles. These have also proved increasingly ineffectual. Jacob Dreisen did a brilliant video some time ago, and I would again advise everybody to go to the Dreisen report for clear-cut analysis of what's happening in the war. Anyway, Jacob Dreisen pointed out that these Stingers did manage to shoot down a certain number of Russian aircraft at the start of the war, but the Russians quickly adapted their tactics, and it's now basically weeks since we got any reports of Russian aircraft being shot down. So Biden talks about Javelin anti-tank missiles, Stinger anti-aircraft missiles. The reality is both have proved essentially ineffective. And then, of course, Biden goes on to say powerful artillery and precision rocket systems. Now, the artillery is presumably the M777 howitzers, which, as I said, have had limited effectiveness and failed in the Great Kharkiv counteroffensive. Precision rocket systems presumably refers to the multiple launch rocket systems, the M270 or the wheeled version of this. But then we go on to read from Biden that we are not encouraging or enabling, the key word is enabling, Ukraine to strike beyond its borders. So it seems that whatever systems, rocket systems, the United States is going to provide to Ukraine, they will not be the really powerful, very long-range rocket systems that apparently Ukraine was seeking and which it was hoping it could use to attack Russian bases and logistical supply points and ammunition depots and those sort of things deep in Ukraine, deep in Russia itself. So that idea, it seems, has been completely abandoned. Well, what are they then supplying? Well, it's not clear at all from this report, from this op-ed of Biden's. We're not really told. There's no real way of knowing one way or the other. I wonder whether the United States itself, whether the Pentagon has itself come to a clear decision, because shorter range multiple rocket launch systems, such as have been talked about, simply duplicate, as far as I can see, capability that Ukraine has already. It has already lost most of its multiple rocket launch systems, but there's no reason to think that the US systems are any more effective if they're shorter ranged than the ones that Ukraine had previously. And in any event, they're not going to be able, the Americans are not going to be able to supply Ukraine with enough of these systems to replace those it has lost one for one. So it already looks extremely confused. But the key words here, again, are those in the op-ed: to place Ukraine in the strongest possible position at the negotiating table. So, men, Ukrainians are being sacrificed. Ukraine is being destroyed to improve, theoretically, Ukraine's bargaining power in the run-up to negotiations, except surely, more plausibly, what's happening is going to be the opposite, because all the indications are that throwing more Ukrainian troops into the battlefields is not going to strengthen Ukraine's position. As these troops are killed, as these military units that they belong to are destroyed, as others of these troops are wounded and captured, as Ukraine actually loses more territory than it gains, as more material is destroyed, Ukraine's bargaining position is not strengthened, it is weakened. The longer this war goes on for, Ukraine's military position gets weaker. And there is no sign that the Russians are running out of men or munitions or rocket or missile systems or aircraft as they fight this war. In fact, all the indications are that the Russians are still fighting this war with only a very small proportion of their total military mobilized in order to win, in order to pursue their strategy in it. I mean, reports I've been reading of the Russians seizing refrigerators and washing machines in Ukraine and cranking out microchips from them in order to plant them in their missiles are just absurd. Again, I strongly suspect that one of the factors that may be influencing this misconceived strategy, both in Washington and Kiev and elsewhere, the idea that Ukraine, if it goes on holding out long enough, that the Russians themselves will suffer so much attrition that they will be forced to the negotiating table before Ukraine itself collapses. That all of this is based on assumptions about Russian losses of men and material based on Ukrainian claims, which, to say it frankly, are wildly unreliable and almost certainly highly exaggerated. If that is correct, then this war of attrition is not one that Ukraine can hope to win. It's clearly one, instead, which it is clearly losing. Now, I'm going to say something else, which is that even if some of these guesses about Russian losses are true, Western powers cannot be certain of this. And hoping that Russia runs out of men, machines, and experiences problems in its economy before Ukraine collapses. It seems to me that this is an incredible, reckless gamble with Ukraine and its future, which Western leaders, to be straightforward about it, have no right to make, given that the intelligence, the information, cannot be fully reliable. Anyway, I'm going to now quickly turn to other things. We now have more information about this oil embargo idea. It turns out that the European Union itself doesn't really have much faith in it, because they're already saying that if it fails, they've already got a contingency plan. If EU countries running short of oil start to buy oil from Russia, circumventing the embargo, well, the EU is going to impose tariffs on Russian oil instead in order to try to price it out of European markets. That doesn't suggest great confidence in this oil embargo idea. I have to say anyway that this whole oil embargo seems to me extremely odd from almost every conceivable point of view. When the Arab states imposed an oil embargo on the West in 1973, they cut supplies of oil to the West in order to force an economic crisis, which they hoped would force the Western powers to pressure Israel into making strategic concessions in the great contest between the Arab states and Israel that was raging at that time. It was the Arab states that cut off oil to the West. This time, the West is cutting off Russian oil to itself, creating what the International Energy Agency says is a worse energy crisis than the one that followed the Arab oil embargo of 1973. The logic of this already looks extremely strange. It seems like a kind of reverse embargo, or perhaps more logically, an embargo, an energy embargo that the Western states are imposing on themselves and, of course, on their own populations and their own industries. Anyway, the consequence of this embargo idea, this oil ban, is that the ruble immediately strengthened, suggesting that the money markets, the financial markets, at least in Moscow, assume that it will result in higher oil prices and therefore an increase in the Russian trade surplus, leading to a further rise, a further strengthening in the ruble. So that's so much for that. Now, the other thing is that, as discussed some days ago, about a week ago, on the 25th of May, the United States did indeed drop the waiver that Russia had that enabled the Russians to pay American bondholders in dollars. American bondholders of Russian bonds, I should say, in dollars. Well, that was supposed to force Russia into default. Now, the Russians have come up with an idea, and it is obviously an echo of the completely successful gas for rubles scheme. What they're proposing is that American holders of Russian bonds, open corresponding accounts in Russian banks, presumably Gazprom Bank. In other words, they open dollar and ruble accounts, and the Russians will pay the amount of the bonds into the ruble account held by these bondholders in these Russian banks. They will pay the money in rubles into this account, and then the bank will convert those rubles into dollars and pay those dollars to the bondholders. So the bondholders get paid in dollars, the Russian treasury pays the amount in rubles, and it's left to the bank, the Russian bank, presumably Gazprom Bank, to convert those rubles into dollars by presumably selling those rubles on the international money markets, or perhaps even the Russian money markets. Now, I don't see what the fundamental objection to this idea is, but if it's carried out, obviously, Russia will not default, will not be in default, because the bondholders will get their money. I suspect the Treasury, the US Treasury, the White House will not be pleased. They've been pulling every stop to try to force what they call a default upon Russia. And it's conceivable that they will warn the bondholders that if they do open these corresponding accounts with Gazprom Bank, then they're breaching US sanctions. Though I think that's a stretch, and I'm not really sure how that is true. The danger that the US government runs, if it does that, is that it would become even more obvious than it now is, and I mean obvious in legal terms, that it's not Russia that is defaulting on its financial obligations. It is the United States government that is preventing American bondholders, American creditors of Russia, from receiving payment for their loans, for their bonds. And I can't help but think that if the US government continues to push this to the extent that it is, then that opens the route for a massive court case by the bondholders against the US government itself, and one which the US government might struggle to win. Anyway, there we are. No indication of a Russian economic collapse, no indication that the Russians are running out of men or munitions or machines in Donbass, accumulating losses for Ukraine in Donbass. Lives being thrown away on the battlefield in Donbass, Ukrainian lives, for no useful purpose, to delay a total defeat, to hope against hope that the Russians will lose the will to keep on pushing, and that something might turn up and that Ukraine might win on the negotiating table what it's so manifestly losing on the battlefield. Confusion even about the weapon systems that the United States is going to send to Ukraine. It's not a good picture. Surely the right thing to do is to put aside all considerations of face. Tell the Ukrainians, look, even you accept negotiations have to take place. Negotiate now, make peace, except, as Kissinger said, that may mean heavy concessions to the Russians on territory. That may be very, very difficult for you, but realistically, it is your only option. We see that President Biden is not prepared to give Ukraine that advice. That's what his op-ed in the New York Times essentially tells us. So it looks as if this thing is going to grind on through the summer months, with perhaps a Ukrainian collapse sometime in the autumn. I'm not, as I said, going to commit myself to any timetables there. And perhaps ultimately an economic crisis in the West, even worse than the one we are now expecting, as oil and food both start to run out. I hope wisdom prevails. I hope somebody finally grasps that this economic war, this military conflict in Ukraine, are not turning out as expected or as hoped, and that the best thing to do is to seek peace. Perhaps a few glimmers of understanding of this are starting to appear. Let's hope so. Thank you again for joining me for this program today. I look forward to you joining me again in future programs on this channel. Remember, you can find us also on our other platforms, Rumble and Locals. If you join us on Locals, you will be able to participate in the exclusive content that we publish there, and of course in my live streams, which take place on Locals exclusively every Wednesday at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time. Every Wednesday, I should say, except next Wednesday, when I am on leave, at least in the evening, on a walking holiday in the Peak District. But other than that, I'm doing live streams on Locals every Wednesday. And of course, we're on other platforms too, on SuperU, the new free speech platform, on ODYSEE, or on our Telegram channel. You can find us there. And you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and also by going to our shop, buying the great things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our hats, all of those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button, and also please check your subscription to this channel. Well, that's a 55-minute video, long enough, I think, for anyone. More from me anyway soon, and have a very good day.